Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. On this episode, we're going to talk to Major General Chris Smith, who's the Deputy Chief of the Australian Army, about warrior culture. Before we do that, though, I'm just going to, little selfish plug for the last episode for you as well, sir, but go back if you haven't listened to the decision-making and planning process episode on basically, it sounds very process-driven, but we went into a lot of detail on how decisions are made and how you should be making decisions, a little bit about bringing back some intuition into the decision-making process, but also Major General Kraus, who had a heavy hand in the DMPP and the development of, has done a Cove talk on exactly that topic. So go back if you haven't listened to it and have a listen. On this, welcome, sir.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, Tom.
On this episode, we're going to move from sort of decision-making to more who we are as soldiers and officers and talk about the warrior culture. It's a sort of underlings of sort of talk and a lot of talk about who we are. And I mean, the DSR talks to workforce, retention and recruitment and the like, but we're sort of more on the side of who we are as soldiers and officers. So straight away, sort of what's the culture, sort of who we are as people, who are we as people, I suppose?
I might just start by sort of talking about why I think this is important at the moment. I think the big thing at the moment is, and I think most people listening will know that Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defence in the United States, has given warrior culture, I think he's got sort of top three priorities and it's one of them. You know, that sense that it's something that's been neglected in the United States. I think also that it has been a thing that's been simmering away in the army for a long time. And I think as a result, there's been a vacuum left because people like me, senior leaders or generals, have sort of left the space vacant and haven't been describing what it ought to be. Now, I imagine some listeners might not like the term warrior culture or whatever, but the point is that it exists. And whether you call it a good culture, a soldierly culture, whatever, it all largely means the same thing. And it is really important. And I know also as we speak that, you know, there's still a sort of a simmering nasty taste in the mouth from even the then CDF's decisions around symbology that somewhat goes to this particular topic. And I think that in the aftermath of that we've sort of, us senior leaders have left it vacant, and I think that that's a mistake. And so, look, your invitation to talk on the topic I think is very important, and hopefully I can help sort of set the scene. And look, what I'm trying to do here is invoke a conversation in the army that sort of brings it to the fore, and we can help actually discuss and form what we think the right warrior culture is going potentially into the next war.
Because I think there was that sort of cognitive dissonance or disconnect between being told that we couldn't use symbols that would otherwise describe what we do as a function, romanticised, some animated too heavily and all that sort of stuff. Sure. But then versus being told to do that in real life, I suppose that disconnect between what's expected of us when society asks us to war fight, and then subsequently being told that we're not allowed to display that.
Look, I think if we begin at that point, because I know that this is heavily on the minds of many in the army and many veterans. Look, I think General Campbell was acting in good faith, and his intent was spot on. It was to address a connection between some symbology and behaviours that resulted in war crimes. But I think that the lack of conversation after sort of potentially undid some of the goodness, because of course there are symbols like the death's head, which has been associated with very well-performing, long-standing regiments in the British Army, for example. You know that, and I think that it's right that, given that the core of our business is violence, and being good at what we do is actually killing people and being able to do it very efficiently, that the idea of symbology that relates to death and violence is actually quite natural. So I think that potentially, you know, we ended up, I don't think intentionally, sort of bringing all of those things together. And I think that might have been part of the sort of negative reaction among our troops and in the veterans community. So I think that what we need to do now is to sort of have a discussion about it and be happy to have it. It shouldn't actually be a big deal, and actually work out where the right point is.
Yeah, and provide those examples, I suppose, because it is easy in the absence of a role model or a specific culture that we can get around and stuff. It's easy to identify people, certain figures and stuff that we think are warriors and born to kill and stuff like that. Yeah. When in reality, I suppose if we come back to the profession argument, we do a job for the government, not subsequently born warfighters and stuff. I don't know if you agree.
Precisely, and I think that's the point. So I think if we continue on this symbology theme, I think that we would all understand that there were some symbols, and I think the classic one out of the Afghanistan period was the Punisher, the cartoon character and its connection. I mean, I've been reading recently the book Alpha, the story of Eddie Gallagher, sorry, yeah. And the essence of that book is it talks about a rogue individual, his effect on the rest of his team. I think that Punisher symbology was broadly used and connected. The author talks about a sort of a pirate attitude. I think that that's the kind of thing that we need to correct for. But then, of course, there is the more formalised. I think to sort of bring this to where we need to, if I can begin with a metaphor, because I think we all agree that we ought to have a warrior culture. The question is which is a good one and which is a bad one. And I think sort of helping us visualise, using a sort of a metaphor for it is helpful. And I think it's very easy to get attracted to stylistic ideas of warrior or Hollywood ideas of warrior. And by the way, this isn't new. Right? I might read a quote from a book written by Sydney Jary called 18 Platoon, which is quite a famous book. It used to be mandatory reading at Duntroon many years ago. He wrote it, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. And even he talks about this particular problem there, from television imagery and so on, and what a warrior should be. But if I can use as the example where we sort of frame our discussion, the beginning scene of the movie Gladiator. And you've got two clear differences in ways of war. On the one hand is the Roman legions under Maximus, and you get most of us are attuned to how the Romans fought. It wasn't for the individual, and it wasn't for the status of the individual. It was about winning battles. It was the combination of different arms. There was a discipline to it. There was a lot of training and teamwork, and the employment of different weapons and fighting for the man next to you. I think all of that, and even the uniformity and so on, gives you a sense maybe of the ideal warrior culture for a modern army, in one sense, if figuratively. But I think, the juxtaposition, of course, is the German tribe against them. No discipline, no particular, every individual sort of fighting for themselves. As you know, in many of these sorts of groupings, the people fight for their own status and their long-term reputation. But of course, the battle goes exactly as you would expect it. A modern, well-armed, disciplined Roman force, annihilates this particular German tribe and all of their rogue difference and so on. I think that's the kind of thing we have to wrestle with, and it's a constant thing that we wrestle with. But if you were to ask me which one of those best represents the kind of culture for a modern army, I'd say that it's certainly not the German tribe.
Yeah. We're also on the side of military service to the country, or like a greater purpose that's beyond ourselves and our own motives, I suppose. Yeah,
spot on.
And I think you can lose that when you're like, I just need to be as fit as I can and look like this absolute warrior, and I was born to do this and stuff. It's when in actual fact you need to re-assimilate with society and the like. But we're there for a profession. Yeah,
and that's spot on. That's quite astute, because and this becomes the challenge of, we, at the very beginning, through our initial initiation process, the centrepiece of it is that we express our loyalty effectively to the Australian people and to the government, and in doing so, that's the sort of difference where I think some of these more stylistic and sort of Hollywood ideas is that and quite understandably, it's a romantic thing, but they tend to centre on the individual, and they tend to centre on a sort of rogue individual that sort of works against the system, as if the system's the problem, and quite often has a strange loyalty, or almost rejects sort of that sense of loyalty to the state and the purpose for which the organisation exists, or even the cause that they're fighting for. That's the sort of thing that's problematic. But of course, it's very influential. And I'm out of touch and old, and not the bloke I used to be, but I can still remember the appeal of that idea, even as a cadet or as a young platoon commander. It's very attractive.
Because I think it's easy to assimilate with an individual, as in a role model, as an individual, to be like, I know what, and sometimes it's all quantitative metrics, like he's incredibly fast, incredibly fit, incredibly tall. Like she is absolutely jet, intelligent, she also a weapon, you know what I mean? So it's incredibly easy to assimilate with an individual, but it's not that will only carry you so far, I suppose.
No, quite right. And look, I don't need to go through the countless historical examples, but armies that win battles and, armed forces and nations that win wars are those that subjugate the individual for the sake of the team, but more importantly, the mission or the cause for which you're fighting. And subjugating it to the extent that you're willing to give your life, this sense of unlimited liability for others, but for the cause and the nation. In a real sense, armies that win are those where the individuals, puts themselves at the bottom of the pile. That's that sense of selflessness. That's the idea of duty. And these are the terms and ideas that I think would fit with the warrior culture that we seek to have.
Yeah. We're just about to go through an episode of Milne Bay, but like our first success in the Pacific, obviously the turning point. But the one of the heroes of some of the stories in Milne Bay was the individual that would, like, as the tanks, primitive tanks, as they move through without their lights on and illuminate their lights, obviously, from the Japanese, and then the Australians that would crawl up and get as close to the tank as they can and use the sticky bombs, which were probably not sufficient at the time, but they were described as no physical attributes. There's nothing about how they look as a person or how strong they are, and it's not idealistic like we do these days. They're talking about people creeping up on tanks and being absolute amazing human beings and decisive action, I suppose, in that sense, achieving decisive actions on their own.
Yeah, I agree. So the act is what's important.
Yeah. And how
I think another good example, in fact, you just reminded me, is the Australian, the first AIF. If we describe the Australian Army in the First World War, people will lean immediately to things like, the larrikin idea, and that the collection of things that sort of defined Anzac in the aftermath of the war, around what Bean and others had written. But the truth is that the success of the Australian Army, which was at its peak in 1918. Was a function of its professionalism. It had gone from the sort of barely trained amateurs of Gallipoli in 1915, and through years and years of fighting produced a general like Monash, and a recognition that success on the battlefield was a function of professional competence, understanding of logistics, weapons capabilities, weapon effects, the coordination and movement of troops with the effect of weapons, the professionalisation of a staff that does lots of work, and a good staff with a good commander can help carry the day and so on. The first AOF in 1918 was so successful as a function of getting to that point. It was, it's funny that in the aftermath, it wasn't that we reflect on. It's the more romantic ideas, but we can, of course, that's somewhat quite natural.
Yeah, the rosy retrospection piece, you go to it. No, absolutely. Yeah. What about when you talk about like those, I suppose, wearing uniform, we sort of sometimes it was, and I know you released a directive last year about wearing uniform, or not a directive, but you encouraged wearing uniform on aircraft and during public transport, because you're like, let's claw back some of that, identity that we have, that we are professionals and people should be proud. And I think domestic operations helped that a lot, because people would see, and I went down to Tasmania on COVID assist, and it was amazing to see the population really reinforce. It's not our primary job, and obviously there's been a little bit of conjecture about that afterwards, but more so like the idea that we shouldn't sort of get into that tall poppy thing, why are you wearing uniform in public and all that sort of stuff, and embracing that symbolism that is our uniform and being proud of who we are. But then an extension of that, I suppose that's what the episode's about, but embracing the fact that we do things that society does not expect of anyone else.
Yeah, so really that was more out of concern that we weren't connecting with broader Australia as much as we should. The army exists in, all over the country, but really concentrated in a few particular places. We know, for example, that there's a growing tendency here, as it is in the United States, for those who join the army to have a tendency, I'm not sure the extent of the weighting, to come from places where there is a stronger presence, so people know what the army is, or to have family members or some connection, a family friend or something that's been in the services. And there was a concern that, look, what can we do to sort of make this more normalised? Because there is concern that we don't want to be some particular special class separate from Australia. So this was a way of encouraging us to get back and amongst the seem to be normal and amongst other Australians. But I think what it also goes to is that because since the end of the Second World War, we've had of course, with the exception of conscription during Vietnam, we've largely had an all-volunteer force. That's been the core of it. And it's actually, the number of Australians that put on a uniform and serve is really quite small. That it's easy for us to forget too that as I think the recent CGS in the UK, General Sanders said the old adage that regular armies start wars but citizen armies finish them, on the basis that war is never as short as that you would hope. The army you start with, as say, for example, the British Expeditionary Force was in the First World War, is quickly largely destroyed. And it's the recruits that come through, the citizens that are rapidly trained, form the bulk of the army that then goes on to endure the war and to win it. We have to also keep that fact in mind. So the extent that we sort of perpetuate that idea that the regular army we have today is the one that would carry us through the next war, and then doesn't connect with Australians, and to the extent that we're not having conversations like this around the very important but difficult business of war, and even to this minor extent of wearing a uniform when you're travelling on plane just to make a connection. I think that's very important.
I suppose that people thing and an extension of that is this warrior culture, but the people thing is like, a lot of organisation, there's been a tendency in private sector to describe organisations as people organisations, people first. Do you know what I mean? And defence has a tendency to do that as well in terms of like I said, the workforce as it's described in the DSR, retention, recruiting, keeping people, career management is saying that keep people at all costs potentially and allow people to choose their own path. It was the idea that if we also take that approach that we're people first organisation, it's incredibly difficult. It is easy to forget the mission, right?
Yeah.
The fact that we're here to do a unique role and it is a profession and we are, I suppose, warriors, to use your analogy at the start. That's what we're here for, to get in there and get it done.
I agree. So, and this is a really important discussion. So when I worked in the Pentagon General Joe Dunford was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had a saying, priority does not mean exclusivity. So when we have discussions about what comes first, people, teams or mission, of course it's easy to pull apart if you oversimplify it because nothing's a priority. There's the other odd thing that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. And I imagine when people make the statement, hey, we're all about people first, of course it's well intended. You would, of course, want to send that message to the people that in your organisation. But it's like so many things, it can work oddly counterproductively. And the idea of joining the army is to serve. And we serve a very, very noble purpose, which is the defence of the nation and the people in the nation and its interest. That comes first. And to some extent, the process of bringing somebody into the army is a process of taking away that sense of self-identity and its importance and saying, look, in this organisation, the self somewhat comes last, and as a general thing, the service to the nation comes first. That's your purpose. Your mate and your team and others come second, and we expect that you might risk your life to go and save others. Yeah. And you come last. The odd thing about that is that particular mixture is actually very good for people.
Yeah. That they have a higher purpose, sort of thing.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. So it's I do worry sometimes, and of course it's well intended, but loose statements of, hey, we're a people first organisation actually runs counter to the good of what the organisation's for, but actually works against individuals because it works against that neat logic, and people derive an enormous amount of benefit when they have a clear sense of purpose and meaning.
Yeah, that's exactly right, yeah. And that's why I've got a first year division now, so in ADFA, and it's the same thing. They come to you with certain requests and they're like, I really want to do this. I was like, that might have worked at DFR. Now you're in the organisation. We've gone through and we read the charter, the ADFA charter of it, and you talked about inculcation of an ideal that is high, like a higher purpose. It starts to be the point that you're trying to teach them to go down the route of, no, you need to pay attention to what the organisation needs out of you and how it can benefit the organisation, not yourself. And I say organisation more broadly. I'm talking about the more broader purpose rather than the organisation itself. I think
absolutely
transferring to that. Yeah. So I suppose that's the greater purpose thing, and some people want to be told no as well. That's the thing. Like everyone thinks, if you don't, I think you spoke at certain points about killing people with kindness or being too kind to people. They want to be told no and told exactly what they need to do because it's for the greater purpose. If we move from that though, interesting segue is being told exactly what you should do. It's not that simplistic, but I suppose if we go back to that warrior culture, so we've got greater purpose now, and we come back to the warrior culture. If we're not to look at individuals for that, selfish sort of motivation of how you should look and behave and all that sort of stuff, what does warrior culture, if we're embracing it and we're getting after it and we're trying to get into and embrace the profession of arms and doing our job, which is, killing on the battlefield, what does it look like? So what does the warrior culture look like?
Look, number one, it needs to be a culture that can win battles and by extension win wars. So it needs to be a culture that gets you through a battle, hopefully having won it, but equally can get you through a battle having lost it, and then have the right mindset to go and fight the next one if need be, and then through a number of battles to survive and win a war. That's a big deal. But I'll sort of hint. I'll sort of quote from Sydney Jary in a minute that'll give you a sense of that. Sort of moderates some of the more obvious features that you might think that you need good warrior culture. So it needs to get troops through all of them. So it needs, in other words, to be able to sustain morale and sustain fighting spirit. But equally, it needs to imbue the troops. And I mean this for all troops, not just infantrymen or those at the forward edge of the battle area. It needs to imbue you with the ability to kill, and that is the essence of winning battles and wars. And whereas there was, if there was ever any doubt about that, which there shouldn't have been, but I'm sure that there are people that will listen to this now and think in listening that I'm some kind of warmonger. But looking at what's happening on battlefields around the world and if not, the lessons even out of our own experiences in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban, that the essence of war is violence. I mean, Clausewitz tells us this, and he goes to he almost pleads to understand that particular aspect of war gives it its special features. There's nothing else like it. But if you go in without understanding its implications, it has consequences. And that particular feature of war doesn't just affect those in the war. I mean, this was the whole point of Thucydides' description of the Peloponnesian War was to describe the consequence of all of those wars on the corruption of Athens and then eventually its fall. I mean, that's the point. So the culture must address that. But of course, what we is particularly on our mind is that if it does that alone without some regulation or mitigating factors, then you just end up with anarchy or murderers, or it has to. The warrior culture has to be a noble one. And I've been trying to think of a good word there, but I think a noble one that acts from the essence of the country it derives, what the expectations of Australians would be of those that go and fight in its name.
And is that sort of why you're encouraging people to assimilate with society in terms of wearing uniform or being, identified is because I suppose you can pick up those expectations of society when you understand why they send you to do those things or what their expectations are, I suppose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of it. I think, and part of it must be then loyalty. That strong sense of loyalty to the people represented by the government, and then to the causes we go and fight for, and even to the extent that the individual serving may not believe in the particular cause, this particular warrior culture must have the individual put that to the side, and that the sense of loyalty is to act consistent with the lawful directions of the government, regardless of what you believe, has to be part of it. That sort of defines a professional versus somebody who is rogue, to go back to that sort of example we gave earlier. So there needs to be a connection to the state, and there needs to be, therefore, an obedience to the lawful orders of a chain of command, of a professional body of leaders, officers that are giving that direction. That is an essential feature, because of course if you don't have that, then you'll just have everybody choosing to do whatever they like and how they like, and thinking that they know better. Going with that must be a form of discipline, and that discipline has many faces. One face is the kind of discipline that you see in that reference point I gave at the start, that the Roman legions up against that the tribe, the discipline to risk your own life for the cause, your discipline to stand in the face of the enemy, the risk, I suppose, to stand up and fire knowing that you might be killed in order to allow another to take a bound, the discipline and courage for you to risk your life to go and save the life of one of your team, but to, perhaps even more importantly, at the direction of your officers representing the state, to risk your life for the particular victory and a particular objective. And that objective might just be to go and seize a hill to provide flank security for the rest of the organisation, but knowing that lawful order ought to be fulfilled to the fullest extent, and that might cost your life. These are sort of the harder edged things that go with what it is for have a good warrior culture and the kind of warrior culture we're after. But of course, at the heart of it, I think where the challenge sits is around ideas of aggression. And of course, for any army to carry the day, there absolutely needs to be aggression. And, we've sort of trained it over the years, and people will have their views as to how effective it is, but on bayonet training and bayonet assault courses, and there's other mechanisms now, our combatives and so on, all important. But controlled aggression is important. for those familiar, the story of Achilles is largely, and Hector is actually, a story of the difference between the brooding, rogue individual, uncontrolled aggression of Achilles and so on versus the sort of the disciplined, noble, family-oriented, but still very capable and, Hector who capable of killing a lot of people. That I think that's a useful point. But if I might now just read this short passage from Jary, because I think it's good. And he, I think he was writing this in the early 70s. And he says, and just for people's background, he commanded a platoon from, I think maybe sort of a month after D-Day through Europe. Was involved in Arnhem, and then fought all the way through to Germany in the end of the war. So his experience is about as much as most in the Second World War. And he says, look, like most, I would no doubt have suggested only masculine qualities like aggression, physical stamina, a hunting instinct, and a competitive nature, were what was most important. How wrong I would have been. I would now suggest the following. Firstly, sufferance, without which one could not survive. Secondly, a quiet mind, which enables a soldier to live in harmony with his fellows through all sorts of difficulties and sometimes under dreadful conditions. As in a closed monastic existence, there is simply no room for the assertive or acrimonious. Thirdly, but no less important, a sense of the ridiculous, which helps a soldier surmount the unacceptable. Add to these a reasonable standard of physical fitness and a dedicated professional competence, and you have a soldier for all seasons. None of the NCOs or soldiers who made 18 Platoon what it was resembled the characters portrayed in most books and films about war. All were quiet, sensible and unassuming men, and some, by any standard, were heroes. I think that is a great quote, because what it does is he brings us back to earth. In his story, he also talks about aggression in a different way, and he suggests that his experience in World War II was that sort of romantic, aggressive mindset existed back from the front. So infantrymen like him that were sort of in constant contact with the enemy learned a certain respect for the enemy, and, risking being killed, having seen your own being killed, and then sort of dealing with the bodies of those you've killed, certainly humbles sort of naive aggressiveness. He says, hey, look, in his book, that sort of existed with us for about a month, and then we realised how naive and silly that is. What he's reflecting sort of there is a sense of a more mature idea of what a soldier is. This sort of, it's better to persevere and to be able to live well with others, that sense of sufferance, than this, he's sort of disparaging of the idea of sort of a naive and immature sense of aggression. And interestingly, he at the end of the book, he talks about, because he's writing, 30 years after the war, but he's reflecting on, the age of television and what was happening in the 70s. And he says that he was dismayed at the time about the over aggression in the Royal Marines and the parachute regiment at the time. And if you remember, this was the period of time of Northern Ireland, Bloody Sunday, and so on. And I think what he sort of says, look, maybe I can understand it in those forces that are largely designed for raiding and sort of go into battle, come back out, maybe because you're not constantly confronted with the enemy, that you need that heightened sense of aggression to be able to go in and come back out and do what you need to do. But certainly his sense was that it was sort of a thing that existed in those most inexperienced in combat.
I think that that quite goes through individual characteristics, which we talked about before, and then it goes through more broadly. No, that's not like it's the broader purpose, but also the acts, like as you said before, heroic acts.
And look, I think that some people listening might think that an example from a platoon commander from his experience in Europe in 1944-45 might not have any relevance to the circumstances we have today. And I imagine particularly those who might have had experience fighting ISIS or through Afghanistan and Iraq might say, well, that's not representative of modern warfare. But I think the point is that the kind of warfare that we're expecting and what we're preparing the army for is more similar to the experience of 1944-45, if not in Europe, certainly the Australian experience in the Pacific. And I think it absolutely has relevance. And I think I think it was a podcast last year by the US Army Sergeant Major of the Army. Sort of he went at this and described, and for what it's worth, I think it might be worth including, his quote.
I have a fair amount of combat, maybe a little more than the average individual. I've never been to war. Not war like we're talking about, large-scale combat operations with a near peer. And if you haven't watched the Pacific series lately, you know the difference between going to combat and then coming back and going to the KBR gym in the KBR chow hall and salsa night on a Wednesday. Mm-hmm. That is not war.
And I'm sort of glad we weaved the quote in there, because it's like it's talking about someone who has risen to the highest of the enlisted ranks in the US Army, Special Forces, and has experienced a significant amount of combat, but still admitting that he's never seen war, like sort of what I suppose the US Army is preparing for, and subsequently us. But then that was my next question, which was if we take it from the individual and our greater purpose, and then look at the enemy, I suppose the most notable, commanders in the past or historic figures on the battle space were those that had an extremely good appreciation of the enemy. I suppose it's not just about us. It's that, you talked about naivety, to think that you can just step over and to completely ignore the fact that they're, primitive or can't hold their own ground and stuff like that. It hasn't really worked in the past. You said about a month, they thought like that, and then eventually it was an extreme appreciation. I suppose if we look from the enemy's perspective, what are your thoughts on, I suppose, how much we should appreciate and sort of look at how should we look at the enemy?
No doubt that some empathy with your enemy is essential, because it helps you understand how he'll fight and helps you understand how you can get the better of him. I think that's the first thing. But I think that referencing here, this is a hard point. That's why I'm sort of struggling to think about it, because what I don't want to do is to give a sense that what Jary's talking about is it, because I don't think that the experience of the second AIF fighting the Japanese was quite the same. And when sort of the stories were coming back, and then the experience of the troops was the Japanese that would literally fight to the last man, or hold a grenade under their belly and take their own life, but take the lives of a few others, largely when the thing was done. Or the bayoneting of prisoners and so on. That has an effect,
a long-lasting effect.
And that has an effect then on how you fight and how you treat them. So I don't, we can't minimise that. And there's a risk here that in reading that section that I inadvertently buy into a different kind of romantic view of what it is, and certainly not doing that. I suppose though, the challenge there is, and this is sort of at the heart of leadership and so on, and even the way the institution's developed, is that when you engage in that kind of thing, it really doesn't have much of a role to play whether you win battles and wars, but it certainly has a role to play in your relative. The risk of moral injury and what you carry with you for the rest of your life. There's a certain, and it also probably goes to expectations of how we fight, and then to how the war ends. Because if you get involved in that kind of thing, it has implications for those. This sort of goes to that point of a greater sort of sense of nobility. I'm not trying to diminish it because it's hard, and there's a infinite number of stories around this in the heat of battle. But discipline and the role of officers and the role of non-commissioned officers in those moments of keeping control is essential. And it would be, so those moments are extremely difficult, but that's why war is difficult and why we spend so much time training in and emphasising the quality of leadership, but also that matter of discipline. And I think it goes to the preservation of a force and its capacity to continue fighting and its morale and mindset. You know, there's no shortage of examples when you start to go down that path. It becomes utterly destructive. And this is the idea of the corrupting effect of war on people and groups over extended periods of time.
What about when you talk about so showing some restraint? Obviously, at Japanese bayoneting people off on the tracks off a ball, like obviously shows no tactical advantage, but would it leave long-term scarring in those individuals? But if we talk about showing constraint, I suppose the Marines have this, and it's come up on a couple of ethics episodes. It's like they have this thing that restrains them somewhat, and I suppose you don't want to exercise too much empathy when you're in the act because it can make you flinch or pull back. And the idea is, like you said before, you need to be willing to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of others, even if it is you can't understand or it is so minuscule in your mind. But the Marines have this thing where it's like, Marines don't do that. So it's an act that someone does, and then that come back to the broader society. And, it's like Marines don't do that. I suppose, how do we exercise that constraint when we are talking about, killing and the like? I suppose, can we do the same and say that we don't do that?
Yes, I think we can. Now, look, I wasn't familiar with that saying with the Marines, but of course we ought to be able to say the same. I don't, to be frank with you, I don't think it needs much special training. But people know what's right and wrong. But if you know it and you do it, that's the point. There was a Marine colonel with the 1st Division, in the amphib role back, 2011, 12, I think, or maybe even before. And he used to use David Grossman's little anecdote to talk about who you are and who you're not from his book on killing, which is still quite good, although some of the evidence is now disputed. The SLA Marshall stuff's sort of bit disputed, but he talks about, it's a gross oversimplification, but it makes a point that in the world there are wolves, sheep, and sheepdogs. And if you're serving, he'd use the Marines as the example. You're a sheepdog. You're about protecting the sheep from the wolves. And it takes no degree of imagination to understand what qualities go with being the sheepdog. But it's a useful story because he would say, but if you start doing this kind of thing, this kind of thing, this kind of thing, you're no longer a sheepdog.
That's what wolves do.
You're a wolf.
Yeah.
And you no longer belong to the team. You're now the enemy. And we, I think there's some utility in that simple idea that hey, look, we're sheepdogs, we're not wolves. But to understand that in war, that drift towards becoming a wolf is always ever present, and understanding what the mechanisms are, and I've sort of written about this in the past, understanding what the mechanisms are that stop you from slipping over to being wolf are fundamental to leadership and a good institution that carries a good warrior culture.
And I think that vice versa, and to put it back into balance, I think that sheepdog thing is sheepdogs still bite, I suppose.
Exactly.
So yes, we don't want to err on the side of caution, but err on the side of anarchy or becoming a wolf, but also that sheepdogs bite. We're here to do a job, and that purpose is the most important thing, I suppose. So I suppose the purpose or why we're here and understanding. And I think you've been very you've been very honest about, what we do as a job and why we're here. But also everything is that showing restraint. I think your analogy before was really good, because you were talking about how we inculcate people into the military and we change them from civilians into, military professionals. One of those things is bayonet assault course. Like you talk about the height of aggression, getting in there, doing something you would never have done before and actually stabbing enemy, basically. But then at night, reading out the soldier's code in the hallway, do you know what I mean? So that you know the greater purpose. So that restraint, I suppose. Understand the civil expectation and the fact that you will have to return back to civilian society at some point, and those expectations. And understand, I suppose we talk a lot about the enemy and slipping, I suppose, into tendencies that would otherwise, because some people would definitely argue that some of those, I understand you talked about, and my example was bayoneting in Rwanda, slipping into that, having moral scars, but vice versa. Sometimes it does constrain what we can and can't do, those rules and what we know to be true. It's difficult. We're always to and fro. It
is difficult. I'm not sure. This question of constraint around, the rules of war, I'm not sure that they really do constrain. You know in the moment when, who you should be shooting and who you shouldn't. I'm not entirely convinced of that. Although quite rightly people would point at me and say, well, your experience is probably not the kind of experience that really had you in that moment. I'm happy to accept that that really pulled into that moment where you really had to make a choice. I'm happy to admit that.
But what do you think about, sorry to interrupt your point, sir, but what do you think about that? There's this relativism, or my war was this experience and your war was this experience, and therefore I have more justification. It's a wild argument from those that, because postmodernists do that sort of thing, and we talk about individual, every single perspective matters, and you have an experience that I don't have, and therefore mine is more important than yours. What do you think about that though, more broadly?
Oh no, I don't buy that. Don't buy that logic at all. We wouldn't be able to discuss anything or reason our way around anything. I mean, I certainly do worry that that sort of postmodernist attitude and that sense that lived experience
is the only determinant.
Is more important than reason. I challenge that entirely, So certainly, I sort of make that observation to give a nod to the fact that some experience does matter, but no, I'm not so sure. Look, these are hard questions. I think, if I might venture, and this is difficult, and it might be potentially more difficult for others than it is certainly for me. But if I can just relate a story, and it's difficult because I'm going to talk about somebody who's passed away and doesn't have the chance to sort of defend the position, but I don't think that they need to. There's reasons for this. But when we went to Rwanda in 1995, we were issued a order of the day, 10 bullet points. And the 10th bullet point was, there's nothing here worth dying for. Now as a general point, I think many people can realise the problem when you say that, because nobody can guarantee even in that which was expected to be quite a peaceful mission, but of course we ended up with the Kabayo massacre within, 2 or 3 months there. You can't know that. So if somebody loses their life, you how do you give it meaning when you've said there was nothing here? That there's a problem there. There's a problem to the extent then that idea. This goes to warrior culture. These are the sort of hard questions about how do you set it up so that you can kill but still maintain some humanity. But other problems it causes. The mandate for Unimir 2 actually obliged the force to act to save lives of the innocent. Separately, there was a sense from in the UN, but those in the contributing nations about which was political. Not in, I don't say that in a bad way. It was political, and war is political, and these kinds of things are, about allowing the government, the new government that had sort of won its position by victory in the previous war, when the massacre had happened, the scope to exercise what it needed to do. Now, it sort of met its match at Kabayo when, the Rwandan People's Army started to massacre the people in the camp in front of our own troops. And the order was, hey, don't shoot back. And this one, and I was not there during that moment. So this is, again, easy for me to say, and I imagine there's a whole bunch of potentially blokes that I know that are listening to this that I don't know how they'll sort of take this, but it does, imagine it weighs heavily on the minds of those who were there to wonder whether, was that right? Should we have fought back? There was a sense that, that the number of UN troops there were so overwhelmed by the number of the RPA that the sense that they would have all been killed. What was, in fulfilling that obligation, ought they have, ought that have been the thought and the consequence? These are the really hard questions, and that's why I struggle to talk about it, because it's I imagine it's very sensitive to a number of people, but that's what I think weighs on many minds around that. I imagine in the mind would be, well, maybe if we did, it could have made a difference. But I imagine for many, just watching, and many of the RPA were taunting our blokes by literally smiling at them while they're killing somebody, and yet our guys, did their best to restrain themselves on the basis of an order. But I think that we ought to ask the question. I mean, I ask it, to what extent was that right? And I had no intention of giving that example. It sort of came up because it fit where we're talking. But it is useful because this goes to the heart of what it is to be a soldier, following orders, the implications of getting those orders wrong, acting rightly, and when you don't act rightly, what the implications are potentially for people afterwards. And even when you might actually make the right decision, still you can wrestle with it for the rest of your life. That's what this is about. And I suppose to sort of bring it full circle, that's why we ought to be very wary of anything that's stylised or superficial or sort of overly sentimental or romanticised or it's what we want to do or simplistic, because these matters are really, really serious, and we ought to, question when an individual seems to be more interested in how they appear and coming up with a certain sort of cool or warrior appearance. We ought to, as a professional army, be very wary of that, because they're the signs that suggest, hey, something ain't right here. It shows a disrespect for the business we're in to say, hey, remember what we're in here. That I think that if as one measure or one sense of what a good warrior culture ought to be, I think that's one mechanism.
And I suppose rather than like Marines don't do this, it's remember why we're here sort of thing. Like and who we represent. That legacy thing does come through, isn't it? Like the fact that you talked about romanticising the Anzacs and the Aussie larrikin and stuff, but more broadly it does, like it's broader than just us, I suppose. Yeah,
things like we don't do this, that's not us. Or even in this case, hey, should we just stand by here? Or what ought we do? I mean, these are the sort of the profound questions, but they're the ones that'll, you'll intuitively know the right answer, I think.
And I think we sort of defined or tried to define what the warrior culture is, and it's a complex, difficult. We talked about layers and then having a little bit of restraint. Your awesome analogy about sheepdogs, sheep and wolves as well. But I think it's really easy to define what it's not. I think there's been a sort of shift in, we got taken all of our combat equipment off us and then given back Tier 0. Obviously, Tier 0 has a combat belt, a battle bra and a 96, 72-hour medium assault pack. Right? But I think a lot of people lost their equipment, so they started to dive bags were the only thing, or black bags were the only thing they carried out of, and then it starts to hang over into to the army of like, we now deploy with dive bags or cargo, black bags. I suppose, have you seen that follow on from like the deficiencies and like not to dismiss the COVID issues with supply? Yeah. But have you seen that issue like permeate throughout the army?
Yep, I have, and I've spoken to quite a lot of the army over the last 12 months, and this has been voiced. I do think that some of our thinking about equipping, and this is particularly for the Army Reserve, I've got that loud and clear, it sort of comes from a backward-looking view or an expectation that our recent experience of war will be our future experience, and that is a concern because, the way we equip, the way we speak to our troops, the sort of stuff we put in glossy brochures and so on is what really sends a message of where you are. And certainly I've got the message that that doesn't sort of resonate with the kind of stuff that we've been talking about today. Look, the other concern I have, and I've travelled to in the last 12 months and spoken to almost every school in the army, with the exception, I think, of the School of Infantry, of all of them, is a concern that with a focus, and this might be unfair, but it's certainly the right thing to do, but in the process of sort of focusing on an efficiency, to get soldiers through training and into units for collective training, that we sort of focus too much on skills. We lost sight of the social conditioning aspect of our schools, particularly our ab initio schools. And I know that for certain schools, and I think Signals is a good example, for many courses where there just is no field phase. And so we're sort of practicing things but not in the conditions or circumstances that we would find ourselves if we're fighting. So I do see that, and I do worry. But having said that, we're addressing it. Yeah. And I suppose that's the message I want to pass on.
Yeah, I just like individual experiences with like. We deployed as a company-size element to Timor-Leste for a mobile training team to teach the FFDTL officers how to do command post operations and the like. But we were in the bush. Part of the warning order had like a phase of the operation that was definitely field training, and it was very explicit. And we get 2 caterers attached, fly over from the east coast, and both of them, basically the only sort of green thing they had was a toothbrush, and I would argue that it wasn't. Like fluorescent green is not the right type of green. But he was having a conversation with them, being like, there's field training exercise on the, we're going to Timor and there's a field training component. Like, what were you thinking? And they're like, oh, we don't normally go field, so we didn't bring any stuff. And then ringing their troop sergeant and then SIGDETs or loots being attached to like battle groups and then coming like empty-handed, like 2 hands empty. It's like, where is your weapon? Do you know what I mean? And it's like, we don't carry weapons. It's like, I get that you have a technical task, but you are going to be in absolute fear.
That's utterly unacceptable. But if there is a cause or a blame, it sits with people like me. We've somehow allowed a context to develop that allows that to and even just looking at sort of recent experience or even past experience that might be similar to the kind of war we might expect to fight next. And I think I've mentioned this in previous podcasts that all of this advance in technology is not each on its own, changing warfare to be a more technical event, it provides a new context that has the unwitting effect of making combat much harder, much closer, less decisive, and it looks, much like the kind of warfare that we were doing on the Western Front in sort of 1915 to sort of 1917, 18. So I think that the implication of this is that soldiers are first and foremost soldiers, and your trade or your particular area of expertise or skill is secondary. Everybody has to fight, and everybody needs to go in to the next war with a sense that they might have to fight, and that they will at some stage be close to death. So all of the things that we've been discussing applies to every soldier, not just a particular few.
Yeah, this serves as that, I suppose, hard reset on the warrior culture, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that note, that's an absolutely awesome point to leave the episode. But talking about bringing back a warrior culture and really having a good understanding of who we are and what we do, getting an appreciation for the enemy, obviously, going broader than just the individual characteristics and thinking about who we actually are and what we do. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
No, thanks, Todd. Enjoyed again. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.